Right. Thank you, Jampel, and welcome everyone to IHE Delft and the Symposium. Every time a train breaks down, the train network breaks down in the Netherlands, I kind of experience what uncertainty means here. And then at the same time, I'm wondering somewhere far away in the world, a child is probably, waking up to the reality that they've just lost their entire family and they're, lying under rubble. So uncertainty is extremely place-based and different for different people. So I think without further ado, I'm very grateful that we have the next speaker, Ethemcan Turhan. And I have followed his scholarship from quite some time. He's a political ecologist. And the topic that awaits us, future present, uncertainty and resistance in a time of monsters, speaks to us. And hopefully we'll also find hope as we journey through Ethemcan's talk. Ethemcan Turhan is an assistant professor of environmental planning at the Department of Spatial Planning and Environment, Faculty of Spatial Sciences. His main research and teaching interests are situated in the broadly defined field of political ecology with empirical attention to environmental conflicts, energy infrastructures, social movements, and climate mobilities, mainly but not exclusively in Turkey, the larger West Asia, and the Mediterranean. Thematically, he is interested in exploring and supervising topics around climate justice and energy democracy. Ethemcan, it's an honor to have you with us. Please take the stage.
Oops. Put this here. Just get some water first, if you don't mind. This one? It works?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, good morning, everyone. I have to admit that I'm not as a successful scholar as Michael, so I have lots of notes to read from, so I will not be able to deliver that speech, but I hope I will be able to walk you through some of the things that kept me thinking about the notions of uncertainty lately. But before starting, I would like to thank Amitangshu, Jampel, and Katerina for their kind invitation, and also to the organizing team for this fantastic event. It's really, really a big joy for me being here. Well, I have to admit that I'm a little bit intimidated also with the fact that there are plenty of hydrologists in the room. During my bachelor's in environmental engineering, I failed the course hydrology, not once, but twice. Although I have to admit I wasn't really paying much attention or attending the classes until my third time. The great Black American author James Baldwin once stated, and I quote, "People who shut their eyes to reality simply invite their own destruction. And anyone who insists on remaining in a state of innocence long after that innocence is dead turns himself into a monster." End of quote. Baldwin is an interesting character, for he was marginalized not once, but twice in the United States by being a black gay man in 1950s. At the peak of his literary fame, James Baldwin needed some solitude and a safe hideaway, and he found it in Istanbul, Turkey, where he lived on and off between 1961 and 1971. He wrote and published plenty of era-defining works of fiction and non-fiction in this period, all featuring his unease with the institutional racism in his home country, United States. In his short nonfiction book, The Fire Next Time, published in 1961, he goes on to state that, in the end, it's the threat of universal extinction hanging over all the world today that changes totally and forever the nature of reality and brings into devastating question the true meaning of man's history. Well, that was man back then, so... We human beings now have the power to exterminate ourselves. This seems to be the entire sum of our achievement. We have taken this journey and arrived at this in God's name. This then is the best that God, the white God, can do. If that is so, then it is time to replace him. But replace him with what? And this void, this despair, this torment is felt everywhere in the West, from the streets of Stockholm to the churches of New Orleans and the sidewalks of Harlem, end of quote. When Baldwin was penning these lines, none of our contemporary concerns were named yet. from the climate crises to the sixth extinction, from weaponized uses of AI to persistent pollutant forever chemicals, from planetary boundaries to techno-feudalism. These are some of the monsters of our times, and they call for a radical change. Not a change that will restore the business as usual, but a transformative change, which will overhaul the existing state of affairs and push us question and reconsider our social, ecological, economic, political, and cultural assumptions. These assumptions include, but are not limited to, disposability of some parts of the global population, such as the Palestinians in Gaza, whose demise and extermination we have all seen live streamed on our mobile phones, the inevitability of individualism and consumerism. There is no alternative mantra of contemporary neoliberal political economy and its growth dependency. No outside of nativist, xenophobic, and authoritarian capitalist realism, and the so-called supremacy and superiority of atomized, siloed Western academic knowledge in the face of grounded local and indigenous knowledge distilled through centuries, if not millennia. In confronting the monsters of our own making, we discover our place and purpose in the world. In this speech, I will try to reflect on how to embrace uncertainty in a time of monsters. And I guess it's a good time to talk about monsters since we have Halloween coming up next week. And my central argument here rests on the idea that hope and resistance are more productive than optimism and resilience in a world beset by polycrisis. And I apologize to Professor Rector because he emphasized the importance of resilience. I think I will go against the grain today. First, let's talk a bit about polycrisis and uncertainties. Earlier this year, European Commission released a polycrisis exploration tool, drawing on insights from the Foresight report, Risks on the Horizon, which identified 40 future societal risks clustered in 10 categories that's facing Europe today. These risks range from critical raw material dependencies to inequalities, to terrorism, to loss of power for humans in the face of AI, failing critical infrastructure, or lack of consensus in society. Polycrisis is a term that captures the tangled web of simultaneous crises that feed into and amplify each other. The escalating climate crisis, for instance, with its loss of natural habitat and rising temperatures, boosting the likelihood of more frequent extreme weather events and unstoppable sea level rise. In a system that's already under stress, the authors of this report suggest new crises could reduce the resilience of societies, challenge public health, and ripple through economies, widening social divides and triggering political tensions. According to the producers of this report, this polycrisis exploration tool provides a structured framework for EU policymakers, scientists, and disaster risk managers to increase awareness of existing and future risks, map potential polycrises, reduce uncertainties, and identify the most effective policy interventions. This should come as no surprise, since, as Michael Albert reminds us, the term polycrisis was first reportedly used by the former European Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker to describe the converging of crises facing the EU in the aftermath of the global financial meltdown in 2008. Thanks to the diligent work of historian Adam Tooze, this concept has since become a widely used shorthand to capture the basic insight that the totality of political, economic, ecological, energetic, and other crises we confront is more dangerous than the sum of its parts. As with anything, this concept also has its discontents who claim that it means little more than lots of bad stuff happening simultaneously. In their recent scholarly attempt to reconcile multiple definitions of polycrisis, Sienna Mark and others define polycrises as follows. Polycrisis is a state that encompasses a complex set of risks characterized by multiple macro-regional and often ecologically embedded linkages between interconnected systems. Such heightened multi-system risk then raises the probability that an adverse outcome will be experienced in one or more systems, which in turn are likely to cascade to others. And please note the strong emphasis on the word risk here. While it has its deeper roots in complex systems thinking, critical system heuristics, and cybernetics, polycrises has come to define our era, most notably after COVID-19 pandemic. As many social justice activists emphasized during the pandemic, our societal goal in response to the polycrisis should not be a return to normality, for normality itself is part of the problem. In this regard, while the term resilience pertains to the ability to endure stressors and return to a prior supposedly peaceful and stable state, resistance, I would argue in my talk, is about taking action to challenge and change the conditions that lead to crises in the first place. In a similar way, the idea that polycrisis needs to be managed, returning to an assumed normality and stability through technomanagerial intervention, serves to depoliticize the systemic consequences of combined and simultaneous crises. Here I would like to thank Ian Skunas for having written this fantastic book, Navigating Uncertainties, which I learned so much from and rely heavily in the rest of my talk. Skunas warns us against using the term risk, uncertainty, ignorance, and ambiguity interchangeably, for they have distinct meanings with very, very different implications. In his formulation, risk is when we know and are confident about the likelihood of known outcomes, so we can predict, plan, calculate, and control. As opposed to this, uncertainty is when we know the range of possible outcomes, but we don't know the likelihoods of them happening. On the other side, ignorance is the condition when we don't know the outcomes nor their likelihoods. In the famous words of Donald Rumsfeld, the key architect of US occupation of Iraq in 2003, by claiming that the country had a stockpile of weapons of mass destruction, needless to say that none were found, we need to address the unknown unknowns, things that we don't know that we don't know. And lastly, ambiguity is where there is dispute about the outcomes and their importance, even if we are on the same page about the likelihoods. The key issues are therefore about meanings we assign, values we hold, and alternative views we can imagine, rather than about statistical probabilities. In their recent piece, Neil Brenner and Swarnab Ghosh argue that, and I quote, the cascading socio-environmental violence unleashed through the contemporary polycrises is often narrated as an external threat against which cities and some segments of their populations must be protected. And here the word external is important again. Brenner and Ghosh go on to argue that, and I quote, 2 decades ago, Mike Davis referred to the threat of avian flu as the monster at our door, only to revise that formulation amidst the COVID-19 with the grim pronouncement, the monster enters. We might extend Davis's metaphor to investigate the monstrous threats cities face in a time of cascading climate and nature emergencies. In fact, the monster, which is an apt metaphor for the socio-environmental violence, was never relegated to an exterior realm from which cities and rural areas could have safely insulated themselves. Indeed, the myth of externalization, the idea that the roots of planetary environmental crises lie outside of the system, outside of our cities, outside of our towns, or outside the capitalist form of urbanization, energy production, water provision, or delivery of essential services, may be the ideology of our time. According to this formulation, monster, then, was never outside or even waiting at our door. It has always been an internal relation of the capitalist form of urbanization and its drive towards biospheric universalization and degradation. Public intellectual and working class hero, late Mike Davis, is an important reference here since his work constantly reminds us of the need for a refusal to accept the present as the only possibility and the present dictating the future. While Davis is commonly referred to as the prophet of doom, as Joseph Nevins's beautiful obituary for him attests, he was a person of radical hope, one that's produced through struggle and sustained by way of radical analyses and vision. During his highly productive career, Davis always engaged with the idea of borders in both territorial and ecological senses of the word. He was as much concerned with political borders as violations of human dignity, as with the ecological limits, which are pushed to the extreme due to group differentiated destruction of our means of survival, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore puts it. Davis's work repeatedly communicates a sense of unwelcome human encroachment into spaces of other than human. In the early days of COVID-19, Davis wrote that, and I quote, "This new age of plagues is directly the result of economic globalization." End of quote. More specifically, he named multinational capital as the driver of disease evolution. In one of his last pieces, Davis went on to say that in the last instance, diseases and climate crises are driven by similar dynamics, even if temporalities are different. Both are processes evolving under radical uncertainty that at some unknown tipping point may spin out of control. He goes on to cite Marxist French economist Michel Aglietta, who says that, and I quote, "Unknowns of future events are treated in insurance by risk estimates. But unknown unknowns, that is the impossibility to identify the range of future events and even their possible appearance, are the gist of social and natural phenomena and their interactions. Radical uncertainty adopts the second level of knowledge limitation." And we don't need to go that far to find a well-fitting example. Uncertainties and unknown unknowns in the university sector have been increasing largely since COVID-19, but now these are being taken to new heights with rendering of students as customers, scapegoating of internationals, disastrous budget cuts, and solid limitations on academic freedoms coming our way more and more. Peter Fleming, in his eye-opening book, Dark Academia, refers to this perfect storm as, and I quote, "the blending of market individualism with control fixation and quest for cost efficiency," end of quote, which has irreversibly transformed the culture inside universities. The digitalized and overmeasured university is primarily inspired by control rather than functional coordination, in Fleming's words. Just think about the copyrights of recorded classes during the pandemic being retained by university administrations, or now AI substituting for lecturers. Well, California State University being the first AI-run university in the world. Today, universities face ever-increasing levels of uncertainty, which needs to be confronted with solidarity, mutuality, and care rather than futile dreams of control. Economic exceptionalism marginalizes political questions about how the university needs to be run and its ultimate social mission. Ian Skunas reminds us that in the face of troubling uncertainties, offering apparent certainty through alternative truths and misinformation is a tactic deployed by populist politicians and authoritarian regimes around the world. The rise of authoritarian populism in many forms across the world is a stark warning of the dangers that lie ahead when uncertainties arise from destabilization of norms and long-standing traditions, as well as undermining of a protective state that ends up serving regressive ends. And climate change is perhaps the most challenging source of uncertainty faced by humanity today. It interacts with most of the uncertainties we face. Uncertainties arise around the commensurability of carbon as a commodity and whether marketization efforts can genuinely tackle climate change, or how to adapt climate impacts when uncertainties are not evenly distributed and market mechanisms turn out to be inadequate. Out of the Woods Collective, in their book Hope Against Hope, insists that, and I quote, "Hope is not an expectation, nor even optimism. Rather, it is always against itself, warding off its tendency to become a fetish, sundered from solidarity and struggle. This is hope against hope," end of quote. And we must never forget that when hope is not available for the many, the ordinary is disaster. What's dangerous here is a focus on alternatives grounded deeply in false dichotomies of post-environmentalist lifeboat ethics. The continuity between doomist narratives of deep adaptation and good Anthropocene narratives of high-tech eco-modernism is a prime example of such false dichotomies. Yet again, ecological dystopia, in the words of Out of the Woods Collective, could still be utopia for the few. In an editorial I authored during the pandemic, I asked, how do we ensure that acting on and adapting to climate change doesn't mean climate apartheid, carbon negative gated communities, solar powered green gentrification, or the fully equipped climate proof bunkers of the rich doomsday preppers? Embracing and elaborating on the praxis of radical uncertainty, radical care, and radical adaptation, I argued, could be a way out. In our recent book with Marco Armiero and Salvatore Paolo De Rosa, we observed that climate change is always thought of in the future tense, something that will arrive as a biblical apocalypse. But as with all prophecies, that doesn't scare us right here, right now. Things look different when seen through the eyes of communities on the front lines of climate breakdown, whether they are the indigenous populations of the Pacific Islands, working class communities who cannot afford air conditioning during a heat wave, or migrants escaping from poverty or wars, but also from droughts and floods. Solutions to climate change are either expected from nation states and a set of states, or they boil down to individual consumption choices. In other words, the politics of climate change seems to be made either at the COPs, as the one approaching soon in Belém, Brazil, or at the supermarket. Climate change, though, is a quite special disaster. It is omnipresent not only in space, but also in time. It's occurring right now, but it has a strong projection into the future. After all, the apocalypse is always a prophecy and a shadow from the past. As several scholars have stressed, however, for indigenous people, the apocalypse is a memory, not a prophecy. It becomes present and visible through dramatic socio-ecological breakdowns such as the Nakba, Hurricane Katrina, recurrent Australian wildfires, or heavy floods in Derna, Libya in 2003, which World Health Organization defined as a disaster of epic proportions, killing 7,800 people and displacing more than 45,000 people overnight. But most of the time, climate impacts are invisible, especially to the affluent urban classes living in the global north. Yet, overemphasizing catastrophic apocalyptic futures may result at the extreme in despotism or apathy, and certainly lead to an unbalanced, undemocratic debate around mitigation and adaptation options. On this point, Michael Albert says that rather than risking the fight for a better future, risking the pain and disappointment of failure, the new pessimists, catastrophists, can lapse into the apolitical quietism that brings them the cold comfort of likely being proven right at the end. So what do we do? According to my colleagues and friends Jen Gobi and Leah Temper, transformation dynamics inspire an understanding of resistance as governance. I quote, "Given the urgent need for social transformation, the failure of top-down formal governance to bring about such transformation, and the critical role of social movements in opposing and resisting the status quo, resistance can and should be considered a form of governance. Resistance is a critical means that non-governmental actors have for influencing outcomes and changing power relations. Resistance and other informal means of shaping natural resources are important in that they serve as a counterforce to those elements that keep governments locked into an extractive status quo, continually failing to catalyze and support the kind of socio-ecological transformations necessary at this moment in time." End of quote. Resistance also opens space for alternative patterns of governance. Social movements recognize a need to create viable economic and political alternatives, and new forms of governance require both resistance and alternative models. Transformative change will require novel systems of governance, as well as dismantling dominant systems of governance today. Resistance movements from the bottom up are well positioned to help tear down the old, while also opening up space for generating new alternatives. As such, we can view resistance as integral to governance. Resistance, therefore, should not be viewed as something external and negative to governance. In fact, it can be understood as a means of testing existing unjust governance systems, contributing to the development of new notions of successful governance, while serving as an instrumental source for achieving better decision-making outcomes and processes. Resistance in this way creates or demands the space for the development of alternatives. In a similar vein, in our earlier work on radical transformations, we have concluded that while transition literature tends to focus on artifacts and technologies that may lead to a carbon-efficient future, such as solar panels, and thus tends to focus on one dimension at the expense of others, we suggest that a resistance-centered perspective encompasses multiple dimensions of transformation and focuses on the creation of new subjectivities, new power relations, new values, and new institutions. This approach recenters the agency of those who are engaged in the creation and recuperation of ecological and new ways of being in the world that is sustainable. In her ethnographic study of the more than human ecologies in the southern Lebanon, A Landscape of War, Munira Hayat defines resistance as the continuing presence in place and the sustainable life-making practices in the face of apocalypse. She goes on to state that, and I quote, "The creative, more than human ability to stay alive in such conditions, and not merely despite them, is what I'm calling resistance, not resilience or endurance." End of quote. I think this definition has a lot of resonance today. In a time we are being preached to be resilient, but stay a healthy distance away from, God forbid, resisting the root causes and conditions of our current predicament. And care has a particular role to play here, as discussed by Farhana Sultana in her recent book, Confronting Climate Coloniality. Sultana goes on to say that, and I quote, "Care embraces but goes beyond the radical care of the self to encompass others, both human and more than human. It is care work that sustains resistance movements, cultural continuities, alternative politics, and new formulations." End of quote. And care work here needs to be understood in the words of Stefania Barca, who defines earth care labor as a specific type of care work of tending to non-human nature that are part of the web of interdependencies which keep people alive. According to Barca, earth carers, or forces of reproduction, through both daily practices and organized political action, take care of the biophysical conditions of human reproduction, thus keeping the world alive. Earth care fundamentally challenges the separation between production and reproduction, which incorporates and reflects the male-female, culture-nature, and civilized-savage dualisms. Today, this is nowhere more evident than the Palestinian notion of sumud, or steadfastness. Resistance, persistence, and steadfastness keep the Palestinian people firm on their ground at the intersection of ecocide and genocide. Andreas Malm argues that, and I quote, "The destruction of Palestine and the destruction of the earth play out in broad daylight. There is plenty of documentation of both. Knowledge of the two processes and how they unfold in real time is superabundant. We know everything we need to know about the catastrophes, and yet the capitalist court keeps rushing to fuel the fireplaces and bombs to Gaza." End of quote. On his escape to death from the Nazi regime, German Jewish philosopher and cultural critic Walter Benjamin famously conceptualized capitalist modernity with reference to the catastrophic accumulation of suffering, ruination, and destruction. Yet he also viewed this destruction as the very soil from which emancipatory struggles would continue to emerge. Against the invisible foreclosing of possible futures, Skoons and Sterling remind us that the opening of political spaces to confront radical uncertainty can become as crucial to the emancipatory politics as many more direct assertions of neglected interests. So the choice is not between bouncing back, building back better, or adjusting to the new normal. It's rather in the struggles to build something completely different. In his essay from 1956 about desegregation and racial justice in the American South, James Baldwin stated that, and I quote, "There is never a time in the future in which we will work out our salvation. The challenge is in the moment. The time is now." End of quote. Following this line of thought, I believe we have to problematize, identify, and act on today's problems first without necessarily escaping into the future. This means we need to think about the future present or futures present in plural. German futurist Johannes Kleske writes that, and I quote, "A future present refers to a certain point in time in the future. This point will become the present at some time. When we imagine being somewhere in 2 weeks, we think about a future present. But that image in our head of that future point in time is present future. It's being felt in our heads right now in the present." He goes on to say that the distinction between these two understandings of the future is essential because only one of those is real and thus scientifically investigable. As future presents haven't happened yet, they haven't become a reality and are not accessible. Present futures, the hopes, anticipations, expectations, and imaginations in our heads, on the other hand, can be examined with the help of social sciences. Hence, the use of environmental social sciences and environmental humanities in navigating a future present ridden with multiple uncertainties. Now let's get back to the monsters. Written inside Mussolini's prisons, Antonio Gramsci's reflection on interregnum, the term used in ancient Rome to refer to the moment of legal and political in-betweenness that followed the death of the former ruler and before the enthronement of his successor. Gramsci states that the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. In the reading of Andrea Muchlebach, this refers to the old hegemony is crumbling, the ruling order losing its capacity to lead through consent, the masses drifting away from traditional ideologies, and the horizon being wide open. In his often cited piece from 2010, "Who Will Build the Ark?", Mike Davis went on to state that we can build a new ark or a world out of the materials that a desperate humanity finds at hand in insurgent communities, pirate technologies, bootlegged media, rebel science, and forgotten utopias. Undertaking a creative translation of Antonio Gramsci's famous dictum, "Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will," Davis suggested that the mental tournament between analytic despair and utopian possibility is personally and probably objectively irresolvable. If we are to follow Brenner and Gosch's formulation of the road ahead, a radical politics of sustainability today must therefore be fundamentally relational, stretching from the city across the web of life to the planetary biosphere, from imperial centers of agglomeration to peripheralized geographies, degraded ecologies, and brutalized populations of the majority world. Embracing uncertainty, as Ian Schoons reminds us, can result in an alternative, more hopeful, and emancipatory politics that helps to decolonize both the mind and the matter. This means developing the capacities to navigate uncertainties, both individually and collectively, as an active response, not simply as passive coping strategies. And it means, at the same time, responding to the deeply structured material conditions and relations that give rise to the uncertainties differentially within and across societies. Here it's useful to remember a poem that's an unlikely character Jeremy Corbyn made famous. In his call for nonviolent resistance, Percy B. Shelley wrote in 1819 the following lines: "Rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. You are many, they are few." This poem, in fact, narrates a dream featuring a procession of masked politicians led by Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister, and the Lord Chancellor in the UK. The names are not given by the poet, but we can think of their modern-day equivalents, I suppose. These politicians are followed by anarchy. For Shelley, this is the capitalist system. But anarchy is brought to a standstill by an amazing event. A young woman throws herself in front of the horses. Her name is Hope. Another compatriot of Corbyn and Shelley, who happened to be born in my own hometown of Ankara, Turkey, also did some smart thinking about uncertain futures. He's one of my personal heroes. also known as punk rock warlord, Joe Strummer of The Clash. As Strummer puts it very neatly, the future is unwritten. So does the future need fixing? I don't think so. I believe we need to fix the present. Thank you very much for your patience.
I think the first word that comes to my mind after listening to Ethemcan is wow. And it's an incredible talk, and the range you covered there was just amazing. That, of course, you made me feel terrible because there are books there that is on my reading list and I'll never get to it probably this year. But the most important thing for me was to recognize the importance of resistance as a site of reclaiming hope at a time that we're in. So without getting into, my points on, there's so much to talk about, any questions from the audience? And can we have someone to just distribute the microphones? When you ask your questions, can you please introduce yourself? And, yes, there's some person there now.
I didn't see where the person was. Oh, you. Get a little bit closer.
Yes. Thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Alida. I'm a PhD candidate here at IHE Delft. I'm really interested in your in the idea of resistance as a transformation and how we create these features together. So my question is, what do you think the role of us as like young future scientists to actually engage with these ideas? Because these ideas are mentioned a lot, but when I do my research, it always goes back to the same either technocratic approach or doing research funded by certain donors that already have their own way of thinking. How do we interrupt this current status quo of thinking that we need for this kind of featuring, but also still keeping a job in academia? And how do you have any ideas on how to engage with it productively, but also still being critical?
Do you want to take one more question?
Yeah,
that's it. So there's one more person. Any others?
Hi, my name is Silva. I just started as a PhD student at the Free University in Amsterdam. I'm studying governance and my first contribution. And my question was related to that hope and resistance should be more predictive of optimism and resilience. And I was wondering what, in your opinion, is the difference between optimism and hope?
So let's take two and then move on.
All right, thank you very much. These are fantastic questions. So the first one, I think that's a very valid concern that you have. Obviously, those of us who are in this institutional space of academia, that's called university, or institutes, faculties, whatever. We first have to start by acknowledging that we are in the ivory tower. Okay? So this place has had a specific purpose in society for centuries, which it may not have today, mainly because the idea of the university for a very long time, say all the way up to the Second World War, let's say, was that it was an elite space. Okay, so not everyone was going to university. It was very hard to access. After the Second World War, Peter Fleming talks about this in very nice detail. University became widely accessible to middle class, working class people as well, because there was this kind of welfare state coming up, at least in Western Europe, but also in other parts of the world after decolonization and so on and so forth. So university became a way to go up the societal ladder, right? But since, say, mid-90s or early 2000s, with the extreme push of neoliberalization of the university, what we are witnessing is university doesn't serve the same purpose of elevating people across the social level anymore. It produces lots of information, many of which becomes unnecessary or redundant or repetitive for the real burning societal challenges of our today. So what do we do about it? And my own take is that we have to break this imagery of the ivory tower, that we are in an elite space, and we have to take the research and knowledge production back to where it belongs, that's to the society. And we have tools of that. You can call it co-production, you can call it citizen science, you can call it many different things. I mean, there are all these fancy jargon around that. But I think the most important thing, the bottom line here is that we should not be thinking about doing research for the society, for we are not there. We have to do research with the society, in the society, to solve the problems of our own making, of the problems that we all live together. So I think that would be my kind of short answer to your question. We have to find our purpose and the purpose of our research. The second point about optimism and hope is extremely relevant. I love this question. Mainly because Terry Eagleton, a very famous literary critic, wrote a fascinating book called Hope Without Optimism. I would very much suggest the book. In a nutshell, the argument of Terry Eagleton in that book is that, and he builds on the massive work of Eastern German philosopher Ernst Bloch, who has this book called Principle of Hope, who basically takes the idea of hope from theology, all the way from the hope provided by religions and so on and so forth. And he says that optimism always has this kind of positive connotation. We are optimistic that something nice will happen. Okay? We are usually not optimistic that something bad will happen. Okay? So that's not how it works, right? So optimism has this kind of well-intentioned but ungrounded kind of reliance onto the future. Whereas hope is not really about future. Hope is really about today. Hope is about how we struggle and try to establish a different future. So I think there are different temporalities of optimism and hope. And hope really needs to be about today and what we do today, how we do today, rather than, again, escaping into the optimistic futures. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think we have time for one more question and then we'll close. Just one point I want to make, because our first question is, we produced 6 million peer-reviewed papers last year. So this is the environment we are in. So it's important to understand how do we look at knowledge production at a time like this. Yeah, please.
I would just say very quickly, Anita did not mention the topic of her PhD research.
My topic is on justice and citizen science in
There we
environmental
go.
science.
I hope that you're going to find the solution for all of us.
Good morning, I'm Jasper, I'm from Amsterdam. I'm an entrepreneur myself in the built environment and the climate goals. We can talk hours about it. Makes me a happy man. But if I'm writing a book, something in the title must be also have an economical background. And I was also analyzed and being analyzed. And if I write the book, then the title, something in the title must be with the courage to look into the mirror. What we created as humans, as a system, economical system, society system, technology system, industry system, worldwide. I was fascinated every day. If we look at this first step, we can, if we have the courage, we don't have the courage, because just last night I was almost going to bed and my eyes was on the news and I see that the Brazil government organized a COP, coming weeks, also gives permission to dig in to search for oil. What says this about the current state of humanity?
There's one more.
Oh, just here. Yes, for that. So can someone pass?
Thank you. I'm Abayomi by name from São Paulo State University, Brazil. I really appreciate your presentation, and for the fact that you could touch different aspects. And one of the parts that I'm really curious about is with respect to AI, artificial intelligence, taking over the university system. Because we've seen some social media ranting online, and we could see people talking about rewriting the history of human. And then we've seen some arguments such as who dictates what is right from the wrong. And should AI, so to say, replace the university education, which we have seen a very big pull, because with the academia, we keep presenting research works that pushes landmark breakthrough in AI modeling and utilization. And the big giants, the tech industry as well, trying their best to market their business. But my point is, what is your take about how the university could avoid this big problem? Because to me, I see it as a complex situation, because the capitalists, as you have said, only care about the profits. And then with the ivory tower, should academia be eroded to the point that AI now teaches students, which we have seen students, most even PhD students, uses AI as their research assistants these days, and as well as professors, and who really make the call in that instance. So how can we avert this problem that is coming with respect to AI replacing the university education? And what are the likely pathways for we research, upcoming researchers that are looking towards the academia as a future, for instance? What do we do? Because should AI replace, then definitely the PhD become irrelevant. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these two great questions. The first one, I absolutely agree with that call for having the courage to look into the mirror, and I think that's extremely important. But one thing that I will argue against is the use of universal we. When we start sentences like we, humanity, we, this, and that, I think it also kind of obscures and provides a smokescreen on the long history of colonialism and capitalism that brought us to this place in the first place. Not that all of the ills come from that, but we have to also acknowledge that when we say we, that's a highly differentiated we around the world today. So when we say we, of course, there are people in Brazilian Amazons, in uncontacted communities, indigenous tribes, that's part of that we, as the people who will be sitting in an air-conditioned room in Belém, which was made out of a deforested zone, thanks to a massive highway construction that connected the airport to Belém. And they will be talking about saving the planet as well in a couple of weeks. So those are those part of the same we? I don't think so. So it's I think we need to really point the finger towards the real culprits here. But I fully agree that we need to have that courage to look into the mirror, but also call the beast by its name. So that's much it. The point about AI is extremely important, and I don't know if AI will be capable of writing major works. It can as well write books like *Sapiens* by Harari. It really feels like it was written by AI. But in a time where our attention span became so short, right? Also, I'm thinking about myself, and I've got two boys who are outside now, enjoying their school holidays. Most likely, they are yearning for their screen time. That they could hardly stay in one channel, or one show on Netflix. They keep changing after every 15 seconds because their attention span is so low. So it's very hard to give them a book with a thick description of the state we're in and ask them to read that, you know. So I think the big issue here is really about the extreme acceleration of time that we are witnessing and how we need to actually slow down our pace in the university and beyond by not resorting to AI or other technologies. I mean, AI definitely speeds up things, right? So you said many PhD students use AI as research assistant. Why do you do that? Because you have a timetable to stick to. You have certain funding. You have to make do within that time frame. So you have to speed up. And in the meantime, you need to, finish your PhD in 3 years, 4 years, publish 5 papers, and write your magnum opus at the same time. Do all of that. So you have to be fast and quick. Just go to LinkedIn, and then you see all of these smart hats telling you how to best use AI for your research. Right? Plenty of them. I see them. You see them. But then there's also Boris Johnson. I don't know if you've seen this. He has a short interview recently where he says, "Oh, I love ChatGPT." He's talking to this journalist and said, "Now I do everything with ChatGPT." Because that's the type of person that Boris Johnson would do. I mean, you can run a country on ChatGPT, and then you get Brexit, and then you get, whatever. So, I think the important thing here is to really go back to basics and think about the means of production. Okay, so who owns the data in ChatGPT? Okay, who owns the supercomputing powers that only a few major companies in the world owns? So you may have heard about the glitch that Amazon Web Services had a few days ago. And then when you look at the Amazon Web Services and the companies that rely on Amazon Web Services, you say, oh, massive amounts of internet tools that you use daily, they're on the fingertip of Jeff Bezos. So he can basically shut them down with a single button. So let's think about means of production of AI, means of production of data, and who owns these means of production. So it's not, I don't think we should blame the people who use AI or ChatGPT or that. Okay, that's not really the solution. That would be the individual consumerist solution. So when I said that climate change politics are either made in COPs or at the supermarket, that's what I mean. If we are going to think about individual solutions, that's the supermarket, right? So I think we need to go beyond that and also go beyond, I would say, not so useful approaches just for the sake of doing like GDPR type of stuff. I don't think that's going to solve the issue of AI challenges we have ahead.
I know there are questions here, and I know there are many questions for Ethemcan. I think what we can do is, when we break now, you can catch up with him. We'll be having coffee outside and take him forward. Before we close this session, I just want to say this has been a fascinating talk to listen to. I think one message I'm taking home is how do we reclaim time? That is one big question. In fact, there was a discussion recently around AI, and I heard a colleague say, well, with AI now you can reduce PhD to 2 years. And I was like, okay, this is
a long time.
Yeah. So the important challenge for us to not only reclaim time and through that reclamation of time reclaim hope. Ethemcan, thank you for a wonderful talk, and thank you audience for being here.
Hi, there's coffee served at the bar downstairs. And please come back in 10 minutes in time for the start of the next session.